Okay guys, MVM3897 or Matt Morozic. I usually say Matt Morozic, aka MVM3897. Back again with some priming. So there are several primers out there. Depending on what I'm doing, I use all sorts of different primers. On my larger resin kits, I will use one of two things. I'll use either just plain old Krylon gray primer. That works okay as long as I make sure that my surface prep is really good, because resin is kind of a funny thing. It really needs something to bite into the resin. Even if you sand it, it still needs something to bite. And in that case, you really want what's called the self-etching primer. And what that primer, self-etching, basically does, it does exactly what it says. It etches itself into the surface. So my larger scale resin kits, I'll use just plain old Krylon gray primer. I just make sure I scuff it up with like a 400 grit sandpaper, and that primer is thick enough that it'll fill the scratches no problem. Now on my conversion kits and stuff, I typically go ahead and just use the Mr. Resin primer. It smells terrible, but it does a great job. I did it on my conversion for the Blue Sinanju. After I did all my surface prep, I just sprayed on a couple coats of this. I wet sanded it once with 2000. Did another layer of this, and then I just gave it a quick wipe with some micro mesh to even it out, and it worked great. The primer I use mostly, if I do prime, is Mr. Surfacer 1000. And again, a lot of you guys probably already know about all this stuff, but this is basically the medium grade that they have. They have 500 right here, which is thicker, larger granules. 1000 is the medium. And then there's a 1200, which I don't use. It's a little too fine for my taste. But this is what I usually use. It's pretty simple, and I'm going to show you how I thin it here in a second. And then there's Mr. Metal Primer. And if you ever do metal option parts and you're going to paint them, it's very important to do a clear metal primer. They do make this in a spray can. I haven't tried it. I basically just put this in my airbrush with a little Mr. Color Thinner. It seems to work fine. But if you don't use this, you'll find that as soon as you touch your metal parts with paint on it, it comes right off. So again, this is like a self-etching metal primer, etches itself into the metal, makes it ready for paint. So what I do when I mix my paints and my thinners, probably not the most economical way to do it, but I go to my hobby store and I buy myself a bunch of these epoxy mixing cups. And the reason I buy these is because there's no guessing as far as my ratios go. A lot of people use eyedroppers and stuff, but I don't know, this just works best for me. Again, there's no right or wrong way. Just find out what works for you and do it. But what I like about it is it's got drams. These are all different measurements: drams, fluid ounces, and then we have the ever important, get the light off of it, see if we can see it better. We have cc's and milliliters. And I typically use the milliliters because it's more accurate. Let me get this light off and you guys see it better. Right there. Hopefully you can see that. It's kind of hard to tell. So I typically use milliliters because it's easy to do 1-to-1 ratios, 1 to 1.5, and so on. The cc's are also okay because these usually come, I think the bottles, like the paint Mr. Color paints come in 10 mils, I think that's right, 10 milliliters of paint. So if I'm going to do a lot of painting, I know I can just fill it up to 10 millimeters, not millimeters, sorry, milliliters, and go from there. So I'm going to go ahead and thin some primer for you real quick. Use the Mr. Surfacer 1000 for the GNX. Just pop it open here. And it's important to give it a good stir because it looks really soupy on top, but underneath it's all this thick stuff. And that's what you want. That's your filling stuff right there. So I just mix it up really well. Just like this. Bring my mixture up and scrape it off every once in a while. I'll get the chunks. And once it looks like it's pretty good, again, my paper towel here, I just use it to wipe off my tools and stuff as I go. So it's clean now, but it gets dirty pretty quick. And I also use it to check my spray pattern on my airbrush while it's there. I'll put the cap back on. And I'll shake it here, but I usually take it and I I tap it against my wrist, just like this. You don't have to do that. It just, I think it helps loosen up any stuff that's stuck on the sides. And I give it a good shake. So now what we're going to do is we're going to thin it. For thinners, obviously I always use Mr. Color thinners. There's two types. There's the leveling thinner, and then there's straight Mr. Color thinner here. The difference is that the leveling thinner has retarder in it, meaning that it'll help slow down the drying process. Excuse me. I typically use only the leveling thinner. Now, when I was doing my Blue Sinanju, I did use the Mr. Color thinner. It was so freaking cold outside when I was painting. I think it was about 30 degrees in the garage. I didn't have to worry about fast drying at all because it was so cold. And my paint came out so slick with this stuff. So when it's really hot outside, I'll use the leveling thinner just to help slow down the drying, because lacquers dry really fast. And you want to dry slow. That's one thing about enamels that's really nice, is that they dry really slow and they level themselves out really well. But they take forever to dry, and I don't have the patience for that. So that's why I use lacquers, just because they dry quicker. So it's important to use this when it's hot out. And I'm going to lower the camera here so I can show you how I mix my paints and my thinners. Obviously we're doing thinner right now. So excuse me for the shaky camera. But I'm going to put the camera basically where I put my eyes. I get down eye level, and I'm looking at the side here. And I always start my ratio 1:1. So I'm going to use the cc's, and I'm going to fill up to 5 cc's right there. And that's why I love these cups, because it's so accurate. And then I'll take my thinner and I'll put it up to 10 cc's right there. And I'll give that a mix. And you've probably heard this everywhere else. You want basically the consistency of milk. So you just take your thing and your mixer or whatever, and you just put it on the side of the cup. That looks about right. It may be a tad on the thick side. And it's just something you learn as you go. You just kind of learn what works. As the temperature changes, if it gets hotter out, you may find that you need a little more thinner. As it's colder, you may need a little less. But it's just, again, a learning curve. So I think that's right. That's it right about there.